What happens when a natural disaster unearths a crime so massive, so systematic, that an entire state chooses denial over truth? Welcome to this journey into one of the most disturbing institutional cover-ups in American history. But before we descend into these cold waters, I need you to ask yourself, how many deaths does it take before silence becomes complicity? How long can a community look away from suffering happening in plain sight? Tell us where you're watching from right now and whether you believe institutions deserve the benefit of the doubt when faced with impossible evidence. Because by the end of this account, you may question everything you thought you knew about trust, authority, and the ease with which society disposes of those it deems inconvenient. This content discusses real historical events involving loss of life. We present these accounts with profound respect for those who suffered, died, and were left behind. This is not entertainment. This is testimony. If you're sensitive to discussions of death, suffering, or institutional abuse, please care for yourself first. In the spring of 1913, the Great Miami River exceeded its banks in the worst natural disaster in Ohio history. The flood destroyed entire towns, killed hundreds, and displaced thousands. But when the waters finally receded, rescue workers discovered something that had nothing to do with the flood itself: human remains. Not dozens, not scores, 200 bodies minimum washing up along the riverbanks, tangled in debris, half buried in new silt deposits. Bodies in various states of decomposition, bodies that had clearly been dead long before the flood, bodies that showed signs of neglect, malnutrition, and suffering that made hardened men weep. The authorities searched missing persons reports. They contacted surrounding communities, they investigated, and they found nothing. Nobody had reported these people missing. Nobody claimed them. Nobody seemed to know, or admit to knowing, who they were. We're about to delve into a mystery that exposed one of America's darkest institutional secrets, where the vulnerable were disappeared in plain sight, where death was so common it became bureaucratic routine, and where the truth was buried so deep that it took catastrophic flooding to wash it to the surface. This isn't just a story about the past. This is a story about how easily society erases those it considers unworthy of memory. It was the year 1913. The progressive era was in full swing, promising reform and enlightenment. Ohio was prospering, its cities growing, its industries booming. But 30 miles north of Dayton, behind high walls and locked gates, in a place called the Orient State Institution, something monstrous was happening, something so commonplace, so accepted, that when the evidence literally floated to the surface, the state's first instinct was to bury it all over again. The Great Miami River had always been temperamental, but in the early months of 1913, it became something else entirely. The winter had been brutal, snow accumulating in the surrounding hills in layers that seemed bottomless. January brought more snow. February refused to relent. March arrived with temperatures that rose too quickly, transforming the landscape into a sodden mass of melting snow and saturated ground that couldn't absorb another drop. Then came the rain, not the gentle spring showers that coax flowers from frozen earth, but torrential, relentless precipitation that fell for 5 days straight. The meteorological conditions were perfect for disaster: warming temperatures, melting snowpack, already saturated soil, and rainfall measuring over 11 inches in less than a week. The Great Miami River, normally a modest waterway, began to swell. By March 23rd, it had become a monster. But this story doesn't begin with the flood. It begins decades earlier, in the shadowed corners of institutional America, where suffering was silent and death was convenient. The Ohio Institute for the Feeble, minded later renamed the Orient State Institution, opened its doors in 1898 on the outskirts of Columbus. It was hailed as progressive, humane, a beacon of enlightened treatment for those the state deemed mentally deficient. The architecture was imposing. Red brick buildings arranged in neat rows, expansive grounds that suggested pastoral healing, high walls that promised safety and containment. The reality behind those walls was something different entirely. Dr. Harrison Whitmore became superintendent in 1902. He was 43 years old, a physician by training, an administrator by temperament, and a believer in efficiency above all else. In his first year, the institution housed 400 patients. By 1910, that number had swelled to nearly 1,200. The buildings designed for 400 now held 3 times that number. Hallways became sleeping quarters. Basements were converted to dormitories, and still they came children deemed backward, adults considered simple, anyone whose behavior deviated from narrow social norms. Whitmore's annual reports to the state legislature painted pictures of progressive care and therapeutic intervention. They spoke of occupational therapy, of agricultural programs, of patients living productive lives under benevolent supervision. The reports were detailed, thorough, convincing. They were also lies. What Whitmore didn't report were the deaths. So many deaths. In institutions of that era, death was not uncommon. Tuberculosis ravaged the overcrowded wards. Influenza swept through with predictable regularity. Pneumonia claimed the weak, the elderly, the very young. But at Orient, people died at rates that defied even those grim expectations. They died of malnutrition in a facility surrounded by farmland. They died of exposure in buildings with functioning heat. They died of injuries that suggested neglect so profound it bordered on intent. And when they died, they were buried quickly, quietly, in graves marked only with numbers, in a section of the grounds that employees called, with grim humor, the colony cemetery. No death certificates were filed for many, no families were notified, no public records were kept. The bodies simply disappeared. By 1913, that cemetery held hundreds of unmarked graves, perhaps more. Nobody counted. Nobody wanted to count. Then came the flood, March 25, 1913. The date would become seared into Ohio's collective memory, though for reasons the state would never fully acknowledge. The Great Miami River crested at 29 feet above flood stage. The water moved with the force of divine wrath, sweeping away everything in its path. In Dayton, the flood killed over 300 people and caused damage that would take years to repair. Smaller towns simply ceased to exist, wiped clean from the landscape as if God himself had taken an eraser to the map. The floodwaters reached Orient State Institution around mid-morning. The facility sat on what was supposed to be high ground, but the river had ideas of its own. Water surged across the farmland, swamped the lower buildings, and then did something nobody anticipated. It destabilized the cemetery. The ground, already saturated, couldn't hold. The coffins, cheap pine boxes, many already rotting from years in wet soil, began to float. Some broke apart immediately, spilling their contents into the churning water. Others held together long enough to travel downstream, macabre boats carrying the forgotten dead on one final journey. When the waters receded 3 days later, the evidence was everywhere: bodies tangled in trees, bodies half buried in new silt deposits, bodies caught in debris piles, bodies in such advanced states of decomposition that identification seemed impossible. But there were so many, far too many to be explained by the flood alone. The first responders, exhausted from days of rescue work, found themselves confronted with a scene that defied comprehension. These weren't flood victims. The condition of the remains made that immediately clear. These were bodies that had been buried, some for years, now unearthed and scattered across miles of riverbank. John McClintock, a volunteer rescue worker from Columbus, later wrote in his diary, "We thought we were prepared for death. We'd pulled bodies from the water all morning, men, women, children taken by the flood. Horrible, yes, but understandable. An act of God, terrible and random. But when we found the first grouping near the old mill site, something felt wrong. These bodies were different. Emaciated, some appeared to have been restrained, marks on the wrists and ankles that had survived decomposition, and there were so many of them, clustered together as if they'd all been buried in the same area and the flood had simply redistributed them downstream. We reported it to the sheriff. He went pale. Then he told us to focus on the living and let the state handle the dead. But the state didn't want to handle it. The state wanted it to go away. Dr. Harrison Whitmore received word of the cemetery breach on March 27th. His response was immediate and telling. He ordered his staff to collect all identifiable remains and reinter them as quickly as possible. No examination, no documentation, no inquiry into why there were so many bodies or why they showed signs of neglect and abuse. Just burial, again, quickly, but the scope of the disaster made silence impossible. Too many people had seen the bodies. Too many questions were being asked. The Columbus Dispatch began making inquiries. The state legislature, already dealing with flood aftermath, found itself confronted with rumors of mass graves and institutional cover-up. On April 3rd, Governor James Cox, to his credit, a man who had campaigned on progressive reform, ordered an investigation. He appointed a 3-member commission. Dr. Samuel Hartwell, a respected physician from Cincinnati, Margaret Whitley, a social reformer with experience in institutional oversight, and District Attorney Thomas Pemberton, a man known for his persistence and his immunity to political pressure. What they found would shake Ohio to its foundations, had the state been willing to acknowledge it. The commission arrived at Orient State Institution on April 7, 1913. Dr. Whitmore greeted them with professional courtesy and complete cooperation. He provided access to all records, all facilities, all staff. He answered every question with calm assurance. The records appeared impeccable: patient intake forms, treatment notes, dietary logs, incident reports. Everything suggested a well-run institution operating under difficult circumstances. But Margaret Whitley had spent 20 years investigating institutions. She knew what to look for. "Show me the death records," she requested. Whitmore produced a ledger. "Every death is documented here, Mrs. Whitley. Cause of death, date, attending physician's signature." She studied the ledger. Then she did something Whitmore didn't anticipate. She counted. According to Whitmore's records, Orient State Institution had experienced an average of 32 deaths per year over the past decade. For a facility housing 1,200 patients with complex medical needs, that number was actually quite low. Suspiciously low. Dr. Whitley said quietly, "How many bodies were recovered from the cemetery breach?" "We're still assessing the exact number," Whitmore replied. The flood damage was extensive. Many graves were disturbed but not fully exhumed, perhaps 40, 50. The cemetery has been in use for 15 years, so that number seems reasonable. Whitley looked at him with the steady gaze of someone who had heard every lie an institution could tell. The rescue workers estimate they recovered or observed at least 200 bodies. The sheriff's preliminary report supports that number. Would you like to revise your statement? The room went very quiet. Dr. Hartwell began a systematic examination of the facility. What he found contradicted every word in Whitmore's annual reports. The dormitories were overcrowded to the point of inhumanity. Patients slept 3 to a bed designed for 1. Some slept on floors. The youngest and weakest were often left in cribs 3 hours a day, lying in their own waste, fed sporadically by staff too few and too overwhelmed to provide adequate care. The occupational therapy programs existed mainly on paper. The agricultural work was forced. Labor patients worked the fields in all weather, inadequately clothed, inadequately fed, collapsing from exhaustion while staff watched with indifference. The medical care was virtually non-existent. 1 physician for 1,200 patients, no regular examinations, no treatment protocols. Illness was viewed as inconvenience, and death was viewed as a solution to overcrowding. District Attorney Pemberton focused on the cemetery. He brought in excavation equipment and began a careful, systematic search of the grounds. What he found defied the official record in every particular. The cemetery wasn't a single area. It was multiple burial sites scattered across the property. Bodies had been interred in hastily dug graves, often in clusters, sometimes stacked 2 or 3 deep. Many graves contained no coffin at all. The bodies had been wrapped in canvas or simply placed in the earth naked. The markers, where they existed, bore only numbers, no names, no dates, just numbers that corresponded to nothing in Whitmore's official ledger. Pemberton's team worked for 6 weeks. They identified grave sites containing at least 400 bodies. They could account for perhaps 100 in Whitmore's records. The rest were ghosts, people who had died and been buried without documentation, without notification, without acknowledgement of any kind. But the most disturbing discovery was yet to come. On May 15, 1913, excavation teams working in the northwestern corner of the property found something that made even the experienced investigators recoil. A mass grave, unmarked, containing the remains of at least 60 children, not adolescents, children. Some as young as 4 or 5 years old, based on skeletal analysis. Dr. Hartwell examined the remains personally. His report, submitted to Governor Cox on May 20th, was clinical in its language but devastating in its implications. The skeletal remains display consistent evidence of chronic malnutrition. Bone deformities suggest rickets, a disease of vitamin deficiency entirely preventable with adequate diet and sunlight. Multiple individuals show healed fractures that received no medical intervention. Several of the smallest skeletons display cranial damage consistent with blunt force trauma. The condition of these remains suggests death by neglect so extreme as to constitute passive murder. 2 words that should have sparked outrage, demanded justice, toppled an institution. Instead, they were buried even deeper than the bodies themselves. Governor Cox faced an impossible situation. The flood had devastated Ohio. Reconstruction costs were astronomical. The state was broke, reeling, desperate for stability and forward momentum. And now his investigation had uncovered evidence of systemic abuse and mass death at a state institution. He had 3 choices: expose everything and face political catastrophe, issue a limited report that acknowledged problems while minimizing scope, or bury the whole thing and hope public attention stayed focused on flood recovery. He chose option 2. The Commission's final report, released in June 1913, acknowledged deficiencies in record keeping and overcrowding that contributed to elevated mortality rates. It recommended increased funding for the institution, hiring additional staff, and implementing better documentation procedures. It did not use the words mass grave. It did not mention the children's cemetery. It did not estimate total death count. It did not call for criminal investigation. And most tellingly, it did not name anyone responsible. Dr. Harrison Whitmore was quietly reassigned to a different facility in another county. Several staff members were let go. The institution received a modest budget increase. The bodies, they were reburied in a new cemetery section, this time in individual graves with proper coffins. Still no names, still just numbers, but buried correctly, as if correct burial could somehow absolve the crime of their deaths. The Columbus Dispatch ran a small story on page 7 about improved conditions at the Orient facility. The story mentioned dozens of graves disturbed by flood damage, now properly restored. Not 200, not 400, dozens, and then silence. But some people couldn't stay silent. Margaret Whitley refused to sign the commission's final report. She issued her own statement, unpublished by any major newspaper, but preserved in the Ohio Historical Society archives. What we discovered at Orient State Institution represents the complete moral failure of state oversight and public accountability. Hundreds of vulnerable people, the mentally disabled, the poor, the unwanted, died through systematic neglect that rose to the level of murder. They died of starvation in a facility with functioning kitchens and productive farmland. They died of exposure in buildings with heating systems. They died of untreated illness when medical care was available. They died because nobody cared if they lived. The state of Ohio has chosen to address this catastrophe with bureaucratic measures and deliberate obfuscation. We have counted bodies, documented abuse, identified failures at every level of administration, and the response is to transfer one superintendent and hire 3 additional nurses. This is not justice. This is complicity. And every day we allow this report to stand as the final word on this matter, we become complicit ourselves in the crime of forgetting these people existed. These people suffered. These people died. By our collective indifference, they had names, they had lives. They deserved better than to die in darkness and be buried in silence. And now, even in death, we refuse to speak their names or honor their suffering with truth. I cannot be party to this. I will not sign my name to a lie. Her statement changed nothing. No follow-up investigation was ordered. No criminal charges were filed. The mass graves remained marked only with numbers. Within 2 years, Margaret Whitley's name had been quietly removed from all official commission records. She existed as a ghost herself, present in the archive, but absent from the official history. In the decade following the flood, Orient State Institution continued to operate. Conditions improved marginally, slightly better patient-to-staff ratios, somewhat improved record keeping, fractionally better medical care. But the fundamental problems remained: overcrowding, underfunding, a societal belief that the mentally disabled were less than human and therefore deserving of less than humane treatment. People continued to die, at slower rates, perhaps, with better documentation, certainly, but they died nonetheless, and they were buried in graves that still bore numbers rather than names. The staff who had worked under Whitmore's administration mostly kept their positions. A few were promoted. None were prosecuted. None even testified publicly about what they had witnessed. One worker, however, left behind a record. Anna Mackenzie worked as a nurse at Orient from 1906 until 1919. In her final year, she began keeping a private journal. After her death in 1968, her granddaughter discovered the journal and donated it to the Ohio Historical Society. The entries are brief matter of fact, devastating. March 14, 1913, 11 days before the flood, 3 children died in the night ward, pneumonia officially, neglect. Actually, they'd been coughing for days, No doctor came, no medicine given. They simply weakened and died. We wrapped them in canvas because there were no coffins available. This happens so often. We've stopped feeling it. I don't know if that makes us efficient or monstrous. Perhaps both. I sometimes walk past the cemetery and try to count the graves. I lose track around 200. How many have I personally wrapped and buried? I stopped counting at 50. That was 5 years ago. Nobody asks questions. Nobody investigates. The families, when they exist at all, are told their loved ones have died of natural causes, pneumonia, influenza, heart failure. All true in the narrowest sense. But the underlying cause is always the same. We didn't care enough to save them. April 2nd, 1913. The flood has exposed everything, bodies everywhere, the evidence of our crimes floating in the river for all to see. I thought this would be the moment of reckoning. I thought finally someone would demand answers. I was wrong. They're already covering it up, already minimizing, already moving forward as if this was just an unfortunate natural disaster rather than a revelation of systematic murder. I wonder if I'll be able to live with myself. I wonder if any of us will. Anna Mackenzie stayed at the institution for 6 more years. Then she quit, moved to California, and never spoke about her time at Orient again. Her silence, like so many others, became part of the institutional memory, the understanding that some truths were too terrible to speak aloud. The patients themselves, those who survived, those who were eventually released, those who ended up in other institutions, carried the memories with them. But their testimonies were systematically discounted. In 1928, a former patient named Robert Williams attempted to report the abuse he had witnessed to the Columbus police. He described the beatings, the starvation, the children dying in their cribs, the mass burials in the dark. The police report exists in the archives. Subject claims to have witnessed numerous deaths and improper burials at state institution. Subject is mentally deficient, and his testimony is unreliable. No action taken. In 1936, another survivor, Elizabeth Moore, wrote letters to the governor describing what she called the dying rooms wards where the oldest and sickest patients were placed and essentially left to die. She described watching children starve to death while staff members ate adequate meals. She described bodies being removed in the night and buried before dawn. The governor's office responded with a form letter thanking her for her concern and assuring her that all state institutions operated under strict oversight and humane conditions. In 1942, during World War II, when the nation was confronting the horrors of Nazi concentration camps, a reporter named James Sullivan published an article comparing American institutional practices to German atrocities. He specifically cited the mass graves at Orient, the estimated 400 plus bodies buried without documentation, the children's cemetery discovered after the flood. The article appeared in a small socialist newspaper with limited circulation. The mainstream press ignored it entirely. Sullivan received death threats and lost his job. The comparison was deemed unpatriotic, inflammatory, and demonstrably false by officials who had never actually investigated the claims. The truth, it seemed, had an expiration date. After a certain point, the crime became history, and history became deniable. The Orient State Institution continued operating under various names until 1981. When it finally closed, the property was sold to developers. The buildings were demolished. The farmland was converted to suburban housing developments, and the cemetery. It was paved over, literally. Today, a shopping center sits on the land where hundreds of forgotten people were buried. The graves were never relocated. No memorial was erected. The bodies remain beneath the parking lot of a strip mall featuring a grocery store, a nail salon, and a cell phone shop. In 1990, 3. During foundation work for a new restaurant, construction workers uncovered human remains. The developer called the police. The police called the state archaeologist. The state archaeologist confirmed the bones were from the old institution cemetery. Work was halted for 3 days while a proper assessment was conducted. Then the remains were reburied on site, construction resumed, and the restaurant opened for business 6 weeks later. Nobody protested. Nobody even seemed particularly disturbed. The forgotten dead remained forgotten. But here's where the story takes its final, most disturbing turn. In 2014, a researcher named Dr. Patricia Morrison from Ohio State University began investigating the state's institutional history for a book on progressive-era reforms. She requested records from the Orient State Institution from the state archives. What she found, or rather, what she didn't find, stunned her. The commission report from 1913 was missing, not misfiled, not damaged, gone. Removed from the archives at some point between its initial filing and her request, with no record of who removed it or why. Margaret Whitley's dissenting statement, gone. The excavation reports from District Attorney Pemberton's investigation. Gone. Dr. Hartwell's medical examination of the children's remains, gone. Anna Mackenzie's journal, that survived, but only because it had been donated separately by her family. Someone, at some point in the intervening century, had systematically removed nearly all documentation of the mass graves, the investigation, the evidence of institutional murder. Dr. Morrison spent 5 years tracking down the missing documents. She found fragments in private collections, copies in newspaper archives, references in other government reports. Piece by piece, she reconstructed what the state had tried to erase. Her book, published in 2019, presented the full documented history, the overcrowding, the neglect, the mass deaths, the cover-up, and the continued cover-up that lasted decades. After the original crime, the book sold modestly. It received positive reviews in academic journals. It was largely ignored by mainstream media. The state of Ohio issued no comment, no apology, no acknowledgement of any kind. The shopping center remains, the bodies remain beneath it, and the official death count at Orient State Institution remains, to this day, exactly what Dr. Whitmore reported in 1913, approximately 300 over 15 years, not 400, not 600, not the estimated 800, plus that Dr. Morrison's research suggests 300. A lie carefully preserved, officially maintained, culturally accepted. The story of the flood that washed up 200 bodies nobody reported missing isn't really about a flood at all. It's about a society that decided certain lives were disposable. It's about institutions given power without accountability. It's about the ease with which truth can be buried when acknowledging it becomes inconvenient. The flood was an accident of nature. The mass graves were not. Dr. Harrison Whitmore lived until 1947. He died in his sleep at home, surrounded by family. His obituary praised his dedication to public service and institutional reform. It mentioned his time at Orient State Institution only briefly, noting he had served with distinction during a challenging period. No mention of the bodies. No mention of the investigation. No mention of the children buried in unmarked graves. He was never charged with a crime, never officially censured, never held accountable in any meaningful way. The staff members who carried out his orders, who buried bodies in the night, who falsified records, who watched children die and did nothing, they too lived their lives, retired with pensions, and died peacefully. Some attended church every Sunday. Some were pillars of their communities. Some told their grandchildren stories about their years in public service. None, as far as we know, ever publicly confessed or expressed remorse, and the victims, they remain nameless. We know there were hundreds, we know many were children, we know they died terribly, but we don't know who they were, where they came from, who mourned them, who remembered them. The state erased them so thoroughly that even the flood, a natural disaster that literally unearthed the evidence of their suffering, couldn't force a reckoning. But questions remain, questions that haunt. How many bodies were truly recovered in 1913? The estimates range from 200 to 400. We'll never know the exact number because nobody with authority cared to count carefully. Why were the commission records removed from the state archives? Who had the power and motivation to systematically erase evidence of the investigation? And when did this happen? Immediately after the investigation, or decades later when the crime seemed safely historical? Most disturbing of all, how many other institutions followed the same pattern? Orient wasn't unique. State institutions across America in the early 20th century operated under similar conditions of overcrowding, underfunding, and complete lack of oversight. How many other mass graves exist, undiscovered or deliberately hidden? How many other floods worth of evidence would it take to expose the full scope of institutional murder that American society tacitly accepted for decades? Perhaps these questions are meant to remain unanswered. Perhaps the not knowing is the punishment we deserve for allowing these crimes in the first place, for covering them up afterward, for continuing to deny them even when the evidence floats to the surface. To this day, residents of the Columbus suburbs built on the old institution grounds report strange experiences. Unexplained sounds in the night, children crying, voices calling for help, cold spots in the grocery store parking lot where customers shiver even in summer heat, a pervasive sense of sadness in certain areas of the shopping center that has driven multiple businesses to relocate after brief occupancy. Most dismiss it as imagination, as urban legend, as the mind creating meaning from randomness. But some know better. Some recognize that certain crimes stain the earth itself, that suffering of sufficient magnitude leaves marks that endure beyond memory, beyond documentation, beyond official denial. The ground remembers what we choose to forget. And on silent nights in those suburbs, when the moon is dark and the air is still, when families sleep peacefully in homes built on stolen land and buried suffering, people still report hearing something beneath the earth, a sound like digging, like scratching, like the dead trying to claw their way back to acknowledgement, back to names, back to the simple human dignity of being remembered. Most chalk it up to settling foundations, to underground streams, to the ordinary sounds of a living landscape. But Patricia Morrison knows better, and now so do you. If this journey through American institutional horror resonated with you, if you find yourself lying awake tonight pondering how easily society discards those it deems inconvenient, then this channel has more truths waiting in the shadows. Subscribe if you're willing to confront the uncomfortable questions about how thin the line between civilization and barbarism really is. Leave a like if this account provoked something deeper than entertainment, if it made you question what other crimes are buried beneath the ordinary surfaces of our everyday lives, hidden in plain sight, waiting only for a flood to wash the evidence to the surface. And in the comments, I want to know, if you were Margaret Whitley, would you have signed that report? Would you have taken the politically expedient path and allowed the cover-up to stand? Or would you have sacrificed your career, your reputation, your safety to speak truth nobody wanted to hear? And harder still, if you were Anna Mackenzie, could you have stayed silent for so long? Could you have participated in a system you knew was murder? Or would you have walked away even if it meant abandoning those suffering to even worse neglect. Until next time, remember the most terrifying stories are the ones that force us to see ourselves clearly. And sometimes that's the darkness we're really afraid of, the recognition that we, too, might look away. We, too, might choose silence. We, too, might bury the truth and build our comfortable lives on top of unmarked graves. The bodies beneath the shopping center are still waiting, waiting to be named, waiting to be acknowledged, waiting for a reckoning that may never come. Don't let them wait forever.